The pattern has become hauntingly familiar. Dawn breaks over the Russian heartland, and somewhere deep within its borders, flames erupt from yet another oil refinery. Smoke billows into the sky as Ukrainian drones complete their mission hundreds of miles from the front lines. This isn't sporadic warfare anymore. This is systematic dismantling of Russia's energy backbone. Welcome back to IntelX, where we decode the strategic shifts that reshape modern warfare. What you're about to witness isn't just military analysis, it's the unfolding story of how a nation under siege turned the tables on the world's supposed energy superpower. Long queues snake around fuel stations across Crimea, Belgorod, and Krasnodar Krai. Citizens wait hours for gasoline that may never come. The irony cuts deep. Russia, drowning in oil reserves, cannot keep its own pumps flowing. This reality would have seemed impossible just 3 years ago when Vladimir Putin greenlit his invasion, confident of swift victory and Ukrainian submission. Fast forward to today. The conflict has devolved into something Putin never anticipated. A brutal, grinding war of attrition stretching across eastern Ukraine's blood-soaked fields. But more devastating still is the silent war being waged far behind Russian lines, where Ukraine's long-range capabilities are systematically crippling the infrastructure that fuels Putin's war machine. Western analysts are watching with growing conviction. Something fundamental has shifted. Russia isn't just struggling, it's beginning to fracture from within. Let's examine the carnage Ukraine has unleashed and understand why this campaign represents a watershed moment in modern warfare. Since August, Ukrainian forces have executed strikes against at least 16 of Russia's 38 operational oil refineries. More than 24 separate attacks have been documented, each strike calculated. Each target strategic, each impact reverberating through Russia's economy. October 23rd marked another significant blow. The Riazan oil refinery, Russia's fourth-largest processing facility, erupted in flames after Ukrainian drones found their mark. This installation doesn't just supply random communities, it feeds fuel directly into the Moscow Oblast, the political and economic heart of the nation. The numbers tell a sobering story. In 2024, Riazan processed 13.1 million tons of crude oil, representing 5% of Russia's entire refining capacity. When the primary processing unit CDU-4 took a direct hit, catastrophic fires forced operators to shut down the entire complex. The domino effect was immediate. Neighboring units, including the reformer, vacuum gas oil hydrotreater, and catalytic cracker, all went dark. Russia lost 80,000 barrels per day of processing capacity in a single night. But Ukraine wasn't finished. The previous evening, drones traveled over 850 miles to strike the Dagestan oil refinery in Makhachkala, Dagestan. Ukrainian military. Intelligence sources confirmed the primary processing unit suffered critical damage, triggering massive fires that consumed the facility. Though smaller at 1 million tons annual capacity, Dagestan serves as a crucial link in Russia's southern energy chain, directly supporting military logistics toward the Caucasus region and the Caspian Fleet. The timing reveals something deeper about Ukraine's evolving strategy. This refinery had only recently been seized by the state after authorities uncovered massive fraud and corruption under its previous ownership by Magomed Sultan Magomedov's family. Now, before Russia could even stabilize operations under new management, the facility lay in ruins. October 19th delivered a devastating 1-2 punch. Ukrainian drones penetrated deep into western Russia, striking the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery in Samara Oblast. This marked the second successful attack on this facility within weeks. The primary crude processing unit, AVT-11, took a direct hit. A massive gasoline storage tank ignited. Electrical transformers exploded. The resulting inferno forced operators to suspend both primary refining units, AVT-11 with its capacity of 18,900 tons daily, and AVT-9 at 4,700 tons per day. Intelligence suggests this refinery won't resume operations until November at the earliest. That same evening, another Ukrainian drone found its target at the Orenburg gas processing plant in the village of Kholodny Klyuchi. Reuters confirmed what many analysts already suspected. This represents the largest gas chemical complex on planet Earth, processing 37.5 billion cubic meters of gas annually. The symbolic weight of crippling such a facility cannot be overstated. The Orenburg region had already suffered earlier in the month when drones struck the Orsk Nefteyorg Syntez oil refinery. Black smoke, Towered above one of Russia's largest refineries, which processes 6.6 million tons annually and produces 30 different petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, bitumen, and fuel oil that keep Russia's military and civilian sectors operational. October 12th brought flames to the Republic of Bashkortostan. Ukrainian drones penetrated the Bashneft refinery complex in Ufa, a sprawling industrial zone comprising 3 primary facilities: Bashneft Ufa-Neftekhim, Bashneft Novoil, and Bashneft UNPZ. Together, these refineries form one of Russia's largest oil processing centers, with combined capacity exceeding 500,000 barrels daily. The strike damaged the AVT-5 unit, a primary refining component critical to the entire production chain. Throughout October, the assault continued relentlessly. The Antipinsky refinery in Tyumen, Slavneft Yanos in Yaroslavl, Rosneft's Tuapse refinery, the Knef refinery in Leningrad region, where fires forced the shutdown of the main unit representing 40% of processing capacity. Then came October 13th and the massive strike on the Feodosia oil terminal in occupied Crimea. Long-range drones hammered at least 5 storage tanks simultaneously. The resulting inferno burned so intensely that satellite imagery captured the flames 2 days later, a beacon visible from space announcing Ukraine's reach and resolve. These October strikes represent the continuation and escalation of a campaign that began gaining momentum in August. But here's what makes this offensive fundamentally different from Ukraine's 2024 attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Dr. Richard Connolly, a leading specialist on the Russian economy with deep expertise in industrial, energy, and defense sectors, has been analyzing Ukraine's evolving strategy. As an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and former senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, his insights carry significant weight. His books, including Russia's Response to Sanctions and The Russian Economy, A Very Short Introduction, have become essential reading for understanding Moscow's economic warfare capabilities. In a recent interview, Dr. Connolly identified the critical distinction. Ukraine's 2024 strikes targeted refineries at winter's end and spring's beginning, periods when fuel demand traditionally decreases and reserves typically build. The damage, while significant, occurred when Russia's energy system had maximum flexibility to absorb the shock. The 2025 summer offensive flipped this equation entirely. Ukraine concentrated strikes during peak demand season when Russians travel for summer holidays, when farmers operate heavy machinery for harvest season, when supply chains already strain under normal seasonal pressure. Any disruption during these critical months doesn't just inconvenience consumers, it cascades through the entire economy, creating shortages that no amount of reserves can quickly remedy. The results speak for themselves. Before October's assault even began, Russia's total refining output had collapsed to 4.86 million barrels per day, nearly 10% below July levels and marking the lowest production in at least 5 years. State statistics agency Rosstat recorded retail gasoline prices surging 2.58% in September alone, the steepest monthly increase since 2018. Year over year, prices had climbed 12.73%, the fastest acceleration in 14 years. A BBC investigation documented fuel supply interruptions across at least 57 Russian regions following the August strikes. While many have since stabilized, the pattern reveals the breadth of Ukraine's impact. Reuters, Bloomberg, and SP Global Commodity Insights confirmed at least 10 businesses, including export-oriented enterprises, shut down partially or completely during August and September. Sergei Vakulenko, senior researcher at the Carnegie Berlin Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, calculated that Russian refinery productivity had declined approximately 10% from July's peak by early October. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has claimed the damage reaches 20% of Moscow's oil refining capacity. Whether this represents optimistic assessment or reflects October's cumulative impact remains debated, but the directional truth is undeniable. Ukraine is winning this particular battle. For ordinary Russians trying to navigate daily life, these statistics translate into grinding, frustrating reality. The chaos at fuel pumps doesn't affect military operations as severely as one might hope. Russian military vehicles run almost exclusively on diesel, while refinery strikes primarily impact gasoline production. But the civilian suffering creates political pressure Putin cannot entirely ignore. Fuel shortages and price spikes make populations angry. When citizens directly feel the consequences of their leaders' war in their wallets and daily routines, support inevitably erodes. Despite Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov's recent declarations that Russian citizens remain completely united around President Putin and willing to bear any burden, history suggests otherwise. Consider Kazakhstan in January 2022. A spike in liquefied petroleum gas prices ignited protests that rapidly spiraled into nationwide chaos. Mass demonstrations, looting, and government buildings set ablaze forced authorities to request Russian military intervention to restore order. Nursultan Nazarbayev, who had ruled Kazakhstan for 3 decades since Soviet collapse, was swept aside in the turmoil's aftermath. Putin understands this danger intimately. The potential for similar unrest over similar causes in Russia itself haunts the Kremlin. Consequently, his government has scrambled to implement emergency measures to stabilize fuel supplies before discontent metastasizes into something uncontrollable. Russia's first major intervention came through export bans on gasoline and diesel fuel, attempting to ensure sufficient domestic availability to meet internal demand. This policy actually originated in September 2023, ostensibly to prevent price increases during harvest season amid southern gasoline shortages. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak at the time promised radical measures to curb fuel price increases driven by inflation and rising international oil prices. International oil prices have since moderated, yet the export ban persists. The latest extension, announced by Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak in late September 2025, applies universally to exporters and producers, explicitly aimed at stabilizing domestic markets amid persistent disruptions from Ukrainian strikes. Dr. Connolly notes an interesting economic reality. The export ban doesn't devastate Russian war finances as dramatically as intuition suggests. Russia simply increases crude oil output rather than refined gasoline to compensate for lost export revenues. Depending on oil prices, this can actually prove more profitable. Nevertheless, whatever previously export-destined petrol now remains domestically certainly hasn't resolved the shortage crisis meaningfully. If it had, Russia wouldn't be taking the embarrassing step of importing gasoline. Yes, you read that correctly. Russia, the global energy superpower sitting atop vast oil reserves, now imports gasoline to manage its rapidly escalating domestic crisis. The primary source is Belarus, Russia's closest remaining ally. To be fair, Russia typically imports small gasoline quantities from Belarus, almost entirely refined from Russian crude originally. Russia increased fuel imports from Belarus last year to cover shortages, but not remotely approaching current levels. Rail-transported gasoline exports from Belarus to Russia quadrupled month-on-month in September, reaching 49,000 metric tons or 14,500 barrels daily. Gasoline transit from Belarus for further export via Russian ports also increased by roughly 1% to 140,000 tons, potentially filling gaps created by Russian export bans. Belarus operates 2 refining facilities, Naftan and Moser oil refineries, each with annual capacity around 240,000 barrels daily, though typically producing around 180,000. For context, Russia consumes approximately 3.8 million barrels daily across all oil forms: crude, gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel. Of that total, as of 2023, roughly 869,000 barrels per day was gasoline. That September shipment from Belarus accounts for less than 2% of Russia's daily requirement. The queues snaking around Russian fuel stations make painfully clear how inadequate this relief proves. Belarus only consumes about 24,000 barrels daily domestically, theoretically enabling exports up to approximately 150,000 barrels per day. Financial Gazette Kommersant estimated in early October that Russia faces a gasoline shortage of 400,000 tons out of standard monthly supplies of 1 million tons, a 20% deficit. Imports of 150,000 barrels daily from Belarus could theoretically ease the squeeze entirely, but enormous questions remain about logistical feasibility, implementation timelines, and long-term sustainability, which is precisely why Russia is taking unprecedented measures to import gasoline from elsewhere. Before the war, beyond those insignificant amounts from Belarus, Russia essentially imported no gasoline from anywhere. Why would it, while exporting endless container ships loaded with refined fuel? That reality has been completely inverted. In early October, Novak proposed eliminating 5% import customs duties on gasoline from China, South Korea, and Singapore. These imports would only be permitted through specific checkpoints in the Russian Far East, and only authorized organizations, Rosneft, NNKJSC, and State Foreign Trade Enterprise Prompt Reimport, would be allowed to supply fuel. More controversially, he proposed temporarily allowing the use of monomethylaniline, or MMA, an octane-increasing additive for gasoline, in production for 6 months. He argued these moves would add at least 350,000 tons of gasoline and 100,000 tons of diesel fuel monthly to domestic markets. Adding MMA to low-octane fuel to produce high-octane Class 5 gasoline would yield an additional 50,000 tons of gasoline, he claimed. However, this represents a controversial reversal. The MMA additive has been banned in Russia since 2016 to comply with European environmental emission standards. This is far from the cleanest fuel formulation. Yet as the European Union continues distancing itself from Russian hydrocarbons, potentially permanently, compliance with EU regulations has become increasingly irrelevant for Russia. Current fuel shortages have clearly necessitated alternative measures. Still, this decision signals a fundamental loss of confidence in the country's refining infrastructure and a willingness to use market manipulation to obscure strategic shortfalls, at least if you're inclined to interpret it that way. Euromaidan Press claims the Russian state has seized an energy company called Oblkomenergo from 2 billionaire oligarchs, reassigning it to state control. They frame this as further evidence of desperate measures being implemented by the Russian government amid collapsing refining capacity. While many observers point to fuel queues and embarrassing gasoline imports as evidence Russia is collapsing, others like Dr. Connolly urge caution against premature conclusions. True, gasoline prices hit historical peaks repeatedly throughout the summer. Average gasoline prices at stations nationwide rose 8.36% from January to September 2025, more than double the inflation rate of 4.16% for the same period, according to official Rostat data. As of early October, retail gasoline prices had outpaced inflation for 9 consecutive weeks. Yet that's still only a year-to-date increase of less than 10%. That's actually less than inflation in Ukraine itself, and not the magnitude that typically triggers mass protests or regime-threatening unrest. Ukraine is clearly causing major disruptions in certain regions, but they've typically been concentrated in the furthest reaches of this geographically massive nation, the Far East, Crimea, Donetsk. Evidence from numerous YouTube videos by ordinary travelers shows the pain hasn't really penetrated Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and other key central cities. These urban centers represent where Ukraine would need to generate the kind of social unrest they hope will force Putin to the negotiating table on terms unfavorable to Russia, the ultimate purpose behind these strikes. The problem for Ukraine, according to Dr. Connolly, is that they're still not striking Russian refineries frequently enough or with sufficient destructive power to inflict that level of systemic damage. Part of this limitation stems from the massive distances drones must travel to reach most Russian refineries. These distances necessitate smaller warheads, typically only up to a couple hundred pounds. That's simply insufficient to cripple Russian refineries, not at 1 strike per refinery per month or less. Connolly cautions that oil refineries are engineered specifically to limit explosion damage, for instance through compartmentalization of storage facilities. They handle the most flammable materials on Earth, after all. They're also typically massive, sprawling industrial complexes. This means while a single drone strike with, say, a 300-pound warhead will cause spectacular fires and suspend operations, it's extremely unlikely that all output at a large refinery will completely halt, and repairs can generally be executed quite rapidly. Vakilenko of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center corroborates this assessment, stating that to date most refineries have returned to near full capacity operation within 1 to 2 weeks of being struck. Russia has also been observed installing netting and other anti-drone protection at its refineries, and recently passed legislation allowing mobilization of war veterans to protect these facilities. While this also demonstrates how significant an issue Ukraine's drone strikes have become, if Ukraine's actions provide any guide, these measures should reduce strike effectiveness. Connolly also points to Russia's inability to decisively destroy Ukraine's energy grid, even with much heavier, much more sustained bombardments, as grounds for caution. If Russia lacks the capacity to eliminate Ukraine's energy systems with a vastly larger arsenal, it's unreasonable to expect Ukraine to inflict more significant damage on Russia's much larger, much more geographically dispersed oil refining industry with less firepower. This is where those long-range missiles Zelensky is lobbying so intensely to secure might change the strategic calculus significantly. But in the meantime, Ukraine's strikes on Russian refineries during recent months haven't gone unanswered. Russia's relentless retaliatory bombardments of Ukrainian power and gas facilities have, He already forced most of the country to endure rolling emergency blackouts, or worse. The heating season's start has been delayed, and growing numbers of authorities are warning about an extremely difficult winter ahead. The stark reality remains: Russia's war machine is showing cracks under mounting pressure. Ukraine's relentless strikes have exposed vulnerabilities the Kremlin can no longer conceal, not just on battlefields, but within Russia itself, where fuel shortages, economic strain, and public discontent are accumulating. The illusion of invincibility that Putin attempts to project is fading, replaced by the grinding reality of a nation struggling to fuel its own pumps while prosecuting an increasingly costly war. This is strategic warfare reimagined for the 21st century. Not tank columns or artillery barrages, but precision strikes executed by drones costing a fraction of their targets, systematically dismantling the infrastructure that sustains modern warfare. Each refinery hit represents another crack in Russia's facade of strength. Each fuel queue, another moment of doubt for Russian citizens. Each import shipment from Belarus, another humiliation for the supposed energy superpower. Whether Ukraine can sustain and escalate this campaign to the level necessary to force meaningful political change in Moscow remains the critical question. The technical and logistical challenges are immense. The distance is vast, the targets hardened and defended. But the strategic direction is clear. Ukraine has found a vulnerability and is exploiting it with increasing sophistication. This is IntelX, where we continue tracking the strategic shifts that define modern conflict. If you want to stay ahead of the news cycle and understand not just what's happening, but why it matters, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're analyzing the moves that mainstream media overlooks, decoding the strategies that will determine this war's outcome. The battle for Ukraine's future is being fought not just in trenches, but at refineries hundreds of miles inside Russia, and that changes everything.